everybody. Welcome back to the Blue Ribbon Project. I'm Dr. Donald James, your host. So first I want to apologize for my absence. I had COVID a couple times and some other things got in the way and I was unable to get to the podcast. So I want to apologize for that, but back in the saddle and we're going to move forward. So what I thought I'd do today is, rather than have a guest, and I'll have guests around the topics that I'm going to discuss today moving forward. But for now, I thought I'd talk about the teacher and administrator shortage in education. So for months, I've been writing about and seeing posts about the teacher and educational leadership shortage, much of which is around the why we have this shortage and their negative things. Now, that's not to say those things aren't accurate or legitimate, but there are a lot of really good reasons to go into education. So first, I'm going to mention a couple of the negative. And I'll also try to build a story around with some historical context around why we are where we are and what we can do about it. Okay, so one, we know there's a shortage because fewer people are in the pipeline, right? They just aren't going into education. And teachers are retiring. Principals are retiring. I just put something up on my LinkedIn page a short while ago that over the next 5 years, 63% of principals do not think they'll be in their current position. They plan to leave. 63% in 5 years. The number is even higher if you talk about the next 9 years. I posted a video from CITE, the New York State Teachers Union, around the teacher shortage and the number of teachers that we're going to need in the state. So the shortage is real. And it's real in other areas more so, meaning the number one shortage area is mathematics. Number two is special education. Number 6 is ESL. And of course, there are others in between, but those are some real specific areas where we know we need folks. We also know we need school leaders. So people don't go into the field because of the salary. The salary has always been a problem. That's not a new phenomenon. Inflation is a problem, so salaries are not keeping pace. Again, that's not a new phenomenon. That was true, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I first started teaching. There's testing fatigue, although that is a relatively new phenomenon. It's with ever since A Nation at Risk came out, and I'll talk about that a little bit as I move forward. That's when really standards and standardized testing became a significant push in US schools, which creates a lot of stress on teachers and students that I believe personally are unnecessary. There's research that indicates it's unnecessary. And then of course there's other careers, right? And some of those careers didn't exist years ago, right? With the advent of the numerous levels of technology that are available and the training that people can get now, there are other careers other than teacher education. And then, of course, those that come in, why do they leave? Right. So I will tell you that the number one reason people leave is poor management. Number 2 is leadership. And number 3 is working conditions. Now, do I think that means people in district office or in the buildings are the problems with management and leadership? No, 100% incorrect. Of course, there's always anomalies. Some people who don't do a really good job in their schools or in their districts create these conditions for some people. But by and large, it's these outside forces that push this in. All right. So principals are being asked often to do many things that they don't believe in, whether we're talking about standardized testing movement or the APPR, where you have to evaluate teachers in a way that doesn't make sense to anybody. You have to do different things with regard to data reporting and keeping track of data that has had no effect on increased student performance. Okay, it also causes people to not want to go into leadership. All right, so you're a teacher, at least you can control your one classroom, your environment to a certain degree. You become the principal and you have almost no control in many cases. In many cases, you're micromanaged. By the way, the superintendents and assistant superintendents are receiving the same push and mandates. So I think there's a macro environment that creates this. So I've been hearing about this, and I thought I'd tell you a story, and I wrote it because at some point I may do a blog, but for now I'm going to sort of test the waters and see how this works. And I will tell you that when I went into education, it was immediately, actually, I was in a school of education when A Nation at Risk came out. A Nation at Risk was a report by the Reagan administration that basically said America's public schools are failing. I shouldn't say basically, it said America's public schools are failing. It pushed a focus on increased rigor, standards, and assessment. Sound familiar? It set the agenda for the next 40 years. There is no doubt in my mind that it set that agenda moving forward, and it has lived through every administration since. Frankly, I think it's a failed experiment. Do I think that there were issues in schools prior to A Nation at Risk? Of course there were. But there are other ways to address it outside of the standards push with an aligned testing module that doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. So now that's not to say that all standardized tests are bad. That's not true. It's the over-testing and testing at a young age that creates the problems. We should have standards. We should have places where we know we want students to know, be able to do, and truly understand things at certain benchmarks. We should be able to assess that, okay? But this ill-conceived notion that we're going to test it with a standardized test every single year is flawed. So that's not news. But in the meantime, I still went into education. Now, I was oblivious to some of it. There wasn't social media. There was only a few places where you could learn about these types of things. And I came from a rough and tumble background. So I'm going to read this to you a little bit. And really, why did I go into education? I reveled in watching children learn and grow. You might say, how did you know? Where would you have seen that? So in my high school, there was a nursery school where the teachers could bring their children. And there were hired professionals that worked in there, but they let students who were interested in going into teaching volunteer. So I went in. At the time, people thought it was a bit strange that a guy was going in to teach, especially the younger grades. That just at that time didn't happen, but I didn't care. For me, I grew up in such a way that I was constantly being judged because we were a poor family. We moved a lot. I was homeless at times, and I changed schools often. I think I went to 12 or 13 schools before I graduated high school. So when I entered the nursery school, one of the first things that struck me was that the kids didn't judge me. They didn't judge my family situation. In fact, they were just happy I was there, wanting to read, build things with them. One of the things that I truly loved was watching them as they progressed through the year. And some of the things we did, we knew what were pre-reading things we were looking for. Do they know how to hold the book? Do they know how to turn the page? We didn't have words in them. They were picture books. And everything was non-judgmental. We just found a way to make this work. My point in sharing this is the positive aspects of that experience, which could happen at any time for someone. It doesn't have to happen in high school. It could happen at another time. So I went to a state school in Pennsylvania that despite all the noise that, I was not college material because I came from a poor home, or that I was a guy going into education, I didn't care. I went to a well-regarded state school that specialized in developing good teachers. Undergrad was an interesting time. I was an emancipated individual. I worked full-time in the restaurant industry, and I immersed myself in my ed classes, my teacher ed classes. There were challenges and I had doubts. However, I was beyond happy. It really hit home when I student taught. My first placement was grade 2. It was extremely challenging. First of all, I was exhausted from getting up and being in a room with 25 second graders all day. I never missed a day. The experience and what the students taught me were more than I could have ever learned in a college classroom. I just couldn't. A lot of what I learned was what not to do. My second experience was in an open concept middle school. So there was in essence, they called it a pod. It was a huge area where you could hold 6 classrooms, and there were 6 sixth grade classrooms there. And one of the benefits to that, and yeah, that was hard. It was noisy and all that kind of good stuff. But there were 5 other people teaching while I was teaching. And there was always somebody who wasn't teaching because I was teaching their class. And so I had an opportunity to engage with all of those individuals about my practices because they were departmentalized. So when I taught, ELA, I had the ELA teacher giving me feedback. When I taught math, I had the math teacher give me feedback. It was one of the most astounding experiences of my career. I loved it to get that feedback, and it was collegial. And they had the recipe. And in fact, we should do those things now as opposed to measuring people's success based on standardized test scores. Again, standardized test scores are an important part of schools. However, they're not the be all end all in whether the teacher is effective. Okay. So you heard me say that I was emancipated, that I lived on my own. So the first winter recess came, and I didn't have any place to go. And my roommate, who I'm still friends with to this day, invited me to come to his home for the 5-week recess. So we went there. We didn't have anything to do. His parents were educators, and a close family friend was the principal of a local school. And believe it or not, there was a sub shortage at the time. There was a shortage of all teachers, but there certainly was a shortage of subs. And they said, hey, even if you're not certified, you can sub. So guess what? We were enlisted to sub. All right. So I spent that entire winter recess subbing every day, elementary school, middle school, high school. It was an amazing experience. I mean, you know what it's like when you're a young person going in to teach high school kids. They're going to challenge you at every turn. So classroom management was a skill that I continued to hone, but I loved that work. And then obviously I went back to school, graduate. I should say, obviously, I went back to school and graduated. So I graduated, but when I went back to the greater metropolitan area outside of Philadelphia, I couldn't get a job in the suburban schools. New teachers just had a hard time getting jobs in those schools. And in Philadelphia, teachers were paid, adjusted for inflation, what would be $40,000 now. All right, so not a lot of money. Certainly not enough money to live on. You know, if you had a car, an apartment, car insurance, all those kinds of things, I couldn't live on $40,000. And I think teachers today would say the same thing. Starting salary for teachers now, I think, is in the 60s. You know, that's good. Some places in this country, it's probably what I would have been making, adjusted for inflation. But a few short years later, I got married to a woman who was very supportive of my career choices, and I got my first teaching job in Philadelphia. And it was in North Philly. And if you're familiar with North Philly, it is one of the most impoverished areas in the country. And at the time, it was in the middle of a crack epidemic. I had 40 students on my roster. I had no books at all. My students, only about half of them showed up, and I had no means to purchase supplies, no means to purchase books, nothing. I was just asked, keep them in the classroom, do the best you can. Okay. What I did was I was able to find a copy of one book for each subject that I taught. I taught 6th grade, even though it was in middle school. It was not departmentalized in 6th grade. I still had to teach all the subjects. I found one book. I made copies at night. I know I wasn't supposed to be doing that. There are copyright laws, but I'm hoping that the statute of limitation is run out on that. And I would make copies for everybody. There was no Xerox machines at the time. You had to do something called mimeograph. I mean, there were Xerox machines. We just didn't have them in schools, and certainly not in North Philly. And what I really did was design lessons that at the time, I called them sort of things that students would need to be able to do in life. Now it's called project-based learning. And in fact, I'm still a huge proponent of project-based learning. I did project-based learning all through my teaching career, all through my administrative career. In fact, just did a presentation at the Council of School Administrators in New York City on how project-based learning can be brought into any school. It doesn't matter whether it's a high need, low wealth school or a high wealth, low need school. You can be successful with students with project-based learning, particularly if it's done right. All right, so I'll never forget the principal in this school, an amazing man, large, gregarious African-American gentleman who I'm sure saved the lives of some of those students because of the way he operated. I know he supported everything that I did. I saw then one of the first models that I truly respected leading a school that was in deep trouble. And it wasn't one of those, storied pictures where, he could be in a movie. He was just a real, genuine, caring person who understood the school, his teachers and his students, and was just doing everything he could to help them. And me, to be perfectly frank. I mean, he really took me under his wing in a lot of ways. And he had an effect on a lot of things. I learned more about teaching, in particular classroom management, during that experience than I maybe learned in the entire time I was in undergraduate school. As luck would have it, they needed a girls basketball coach. No one would do it. I did it. It was an amazing opportunity to get to know the kids on a different level. I didn't know anything about basketball, nothing. I'd never played basketball. And there was no internet at the time. I mean, there was the internet, but in essence, you really couldn't access it in an easy form. There was, so I went to the library, got books on, doing drills and teaching basketball, and they won every game, not because of what I did by any stretch of the imagination, but because they knew how to play street ball, and I was able to bring them together in a way that they just didn't have prior. There was no coach the prior year. Brought a tremendous amount of pride to the school and to the students. And I know there were students who came to school because they could play basketball. So this idea that there's so much more than just being involved in the political aspects of what's going on in schools, it was just amazing. And then, and I'll do this in my next episode, I moved to New York City. My wife at the time was from New York. She was working in New York. So I used to commute to Philadelphia from a small town of Pennsylvania, and she used to commute from that same small town to New York City. You might imagine that was an untenable situation. And I got a job in District 2 in Manhattan. And as luck would have it, I was with one of the most gifted principals that I've ever run into. And to this day, we'll tell you that. I worked with an amazing group of teachers. I was a new teacher. It was only my second year. Had staff developers in the school, some of whom you would know. Lucy Calkins did work there, as did Diane Snowball from Aussie, for those of you that remember Aussie. And this principal who is had an amazing career and is now on the Board of Regents, Judy Chin. In my mind, she is the person that led me to want to be a school leader. So on my next episode, I'll get to that. I'll get to that next experience, and then I'll build in some of the things around what I think we need to do to, one, entice teachers to stay in the field, but also to come into the field. So we need more manageable ways for them to become certified. That doesn't mean these alternative waivers, because the research is clear that if those folks just don't stay in education, they drop out of education at a rate 25% greater than teachers who go through a more traditional and rigorous way of training. We need high quality training once they get there. We need to support them. We need mentors for them. We need in-service training. You got to stop micromanaging what's going on in the classroom. And again, that's not the blame. We got to stop micromanaging principals. We got to let them do what needs to be done in their classrooms. We have to allow for peace in the classroom. Leslie Kennedy, and I'll cite her book at the next one, talks about peace in the classroom and how important it is. We have to allow time for teachers to come together, work together, and engage with one another. Much like I talked about in that pod that I worked with, there's a lot of research on teachers having time to discuss their practice. In the States, we have one of the highest ratios of teacher in the classroom than any other country in the world. They just don't have enough time outside of the classroom to hone the things that they do in their practice. We need mentorships. We need to be a part of the solution, not just sit back and observe the problem. Because we can observe the problem all day long. It exists. But what are we going to do about it? And that's what we're going to start to tackle in the next podcast. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen. And we'll be back soon. Thank you very much. Have a great day.